Objectifying people, objectifying women is wrong.
Men are objectified more than they used to be, but there really aren't consequences as a result of that. The body language of women and girls remains passive, vulnerable, submissive, and very different from the body language of men and boys.
If they're even moderately on your attraction scale, they get placed in the object place.
Women, men, human beings, we are not objects. We are not objects that are meant to be used.
Anyway, the reason why I'm talking about this is because of League of Legends. I was emailed this Reddit thread. The objectification of male champions from the official Riot account on Twitter feels really icky to me.
Okay, so Meghan Markle felt objectified. Ariana Grande felt objectified. Chris Pratt... Chris Pratt's just a moron. So celebrities feel objectified. Like meat, so they wear meat. Or being forced to be all looks and little substance because everyone deserves to be known for their substance.
A man cannot objectify you unless you objectify yourself first.
This clearly is the brains of the outfit. Think, just for a sec, why is objectifying even bad? And don't knee-jerk out of your chair. It's a rhetorical question because I'm going to tell you. Objectifying women or objectifying anyone is judged to be bad because objects are judged to be less than subjects. People, meat. I have to say though, this is not really how a lot of humans have thought about objects. So we have a philosophy culturally that no one really believes in that says it's wrong to objectify people. So people, or subjects, as opposed to objects, are split along what's called a binary opposition, in which meaning is produced in a sign system by latent antagonisms, opposites. And with binary oppositions, one term always tends to govern or contain the other. Here, look how neatly this lines up. Now, this particular opposition, the one I'm drawing attention to, is kind of a valve in the heart of modern common sense, which is too bad when you realize that it's also utter nonsense. So if I trace this back to something like a source, here's the apogee of modern thought, Immanuel Kant on objectification. And he writes it like this: as soon as a person becomes an object of appetite for another, all the motives of moral relationship cease to function, because as an object of appetite for another person becomes a thing and can be treated and used as such. Sounds pretty normal, right? He goes on to say that objectifying someone without concern for their personhood is like sucking a lemon dry and throwing it away. And of every possible example of a subject and an object interacting, he goes with sucking a lemon dry. Like, why the hell would you want to do that anyway? But this was an 18th century thing, I guess. Point remains, in most of the philosophy written about human knowledge, active subjects, us, we find ourselves in a sea of inert objects and then think about them. Meghan Markle, Chris Pratt are citing this philosophy without any clue that they're doing so. But if you've read any of this philosophy, have you ever paid attention to which objects philosophers choose to stand for objects in general? We just saw lemons, which is uncommon, but I've read a ton of this genre, and there's almost always references to two types of things, okay? Trees and furniture, chairs, tables. And yeah, philosophers being philosophers are always especially concerned with whether the thing on which they're writing is real or not. And it's not just furnitures and trees, like triangles come up pretty often too. But what these choices of objects have amounted to is a pretty clean break between subject and object, conscious, unconscious, active, passive. Now, to be fair, it's not like philosophy ended there, like Heidegger threw a pretty active hammer into this mess, for example, but still, when it comes to what has trickled down to common sense, using tables, chairs, and trees as the model objects has had its effect, with the subject becoming primary and all the special ways in which it thinks, and then the object becomes secondary, with all the ways in which it just sits there indifferently. So that said, the only reason it's wrong to objectify women, or whomever, is because we also believe that objects don't have agency. Now, I'd like to call your attention to something. What if we rewrote a history of this philosophy system, starting with a different object? What if instead of using a table or a tree as our main example for hundreds of years, we picked a flower, and specifically this flower? Now, like other objects, this flower has qualities like color, height. It takes up a certain amount of space. It doesn't look too conscious. But unlike tables, this flower has also caused wars, collapsed governments, killed millions of people directly and indirectly. And we, the supposed masters of objects as thinking subjects, have been powerless to take control of it. Doesn't sound too object-y, does it? It's done more than any other person could do, with the exception of, I don't know who, Napoleon. Anyway, this flower is an opium poppy, which is different from a table in that you only need one table and then you're pretty good for a while. Sure. And Hume is right, the table doesn't have much agency, but opium, morphine, or heroin, they're also all objects, but they're not the kind that stay nicely on their side of the binary opposition. They overrun this barrier of the subject, his agency, and his thinking, and can, in some cases, completely dominate every action of his life, controlling even the central attribute of the human, which is freedom. So that's not too bad for merely an object. But that's only this flower's agency over an individual. But even the most influential individual has nothing on this flower. This flower has 3 wars named after it over 2 centuries. And in the 19th century, private trade companies drew the British Empire into wars to defend the right to sell it in China, where the emperors kept trying to ban it because it caused widespread addiction. So to supply this demand, huge plots of land that were used to grow useful stuff that people need, like food, switched to growing the flower, like in Bengal, for example. And the British East India Trading Company financed all of this. So you can imagine the borders that it drew there. And then this flower power also financed the rise of a new elite class in the United States, including the Forbes family and the Roosevelt family, who, yes, made America as it is today, but started off as drug dealers. Now, there's a ton of history here that I'm just riding roughshod over, but to make a video on the effects of opium on geopolitics means, 10 hours. And I only want to point to here how an object fueled imperial capitalism, humiliated China in favor of the West, which would have massive implications a century later, and it drew the borders of states as we still know them today, and bloomed into local and global power relations that are also still in place 200 years later. And its story is still in progress. All this caused by a mere object. So this mere object can be the cause of a subject's total loss of agency, also the cause of wars, or the cause of a burgeoning imperialistic capitalism. At which moment, then, do we say that the object is in charge, even more than any of these free subjects that serve, honestly, just like replaceable notes at any point in history? If it wasn't the Roosevelt family, it would have been another one. So the subjects here are interchangeable. The object, though, is not. Should we do a furthermore? Furthermore, the world that those philosophers attempted to make sense of when writing their world histories or the histories of thought, and I think this is one of my most important points, that world that the philosophers attempted to make sense of was not already one of thought. It was one of these in-thinking networks, because that's just the opium poppy. To an even greater degree, you could describe the current state of the world, where the borders are, where the wealth is, what type of propaganda were served, with an object like oil. Now, if the modern philosophers started with an object like oil and its global causal efficacy instead of the table that they were writing on, we may never have inherited this really degraded or negative understanding of objects. Because objects also include an artificial class, cult objects, art, architecture, televisions, phones, and even data. How much have these objects determined our perceptions of the world in advance today? I want to find an end at this bit of a provocation that despite our high opinion of ourselves, in philosophy at least, subjects are not all that subjects have glazed them up to be. Subjects, far from being the masters of the world, are blind to their own insignificance in the face of that. And if anything, I'd place my bets on the objects in this opposition. And as far as that goes, objectifying people sounds rather like a compliment. Now, this binary has been, to be sure, an imposing intellectual representation, one that seems to have trickled down into common sense. But if this situation is an illusion to begin with, then this never really existed. But something has changed now, maybe. The world, appearances, and the objects are bursting out. The object, which we've tried to keep in a kind of analytical cage, is now taking its revenge. So I put this video together based on a lecture series of vlogs that you can find on Patreon if you're interested in some more in-depth content. It's called The Revenge of the Object. But one last thing. Kant's example of the object was a lemon, right? Apparently he was sucking lemons. Anyway, lemons are not native to Prussia, of course, so this made me wonder, what had the lemon done up to the point where it became commonplace enough for Kant to use it as a throwaway example like this? This really stuck in my mind. So it turns out the lemon was doing a hell of a lot. Because you can't grow lemons in a northern climate, then eating lemons or citrus was a status symbol in Western Europe. And a big fad emerged around eating lemons and citrus fruit because you'd have to be rich enough to grow them in expensive climate-controlled buildings called orangeries. So before Kant's time, lemons were seen as a sign of luxury and opulence. But then the European empires, particularly the Dutch, were increasing the supply of oranges from places that you can grow oranges. And since oranges taste better, lemon's status was then degraded and seen as a lower class citrus as opposed to oranges, which became like an upper crust citrus. So this line of lemon status we've also inherited. When you buy a crappy car and it breaks all the time, you call it a lemon. The line of thinking that I want to end on here and point to is this, that the most reflective and rational of modern thought, Kant, only occurred and only could occur within this broader history of objects which are only in the last instance degraded in status. Even his throwaway example of a useless object, a lemon, isn't that cut and dry. So just to put it simply, this picture just isn't how the world actually goes, and it never did. It's past time that objects took their revenge on Western philosophy. And well, what do you know? This moron actually turned out to be right.